Hey folks, George here again. Today we're going to talk about a Japanese animated film called Spirited Away, directed by Miyazaki Hayao. The film was released in 2001 and it received accolades all over the world, including winning an American Oscar for Best Animated Film, which is, quite something. One of the very first animated Oscars, very soon after the animation Oscar was made. As always, I'll talk about all the same details regarding this cultural artifact, an animated film, as I do about all the other works that we discuss here. Because it's a film, we will talk about the plot, we'll talk about the setting, we'll talk about the characters, and we'll talk about the themes. We'll also talk about the formal elements of the film and the structural elements. We'll talk about the historical context of the film, also the intertextual connections, and of course, a few personal details about my own reflections regarding the film. I think the easiest place to start with when talking about this film, and really any film, is the plot. And I think it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward. I'm going to race through a lot of the details, but as an overall plot, it's about a little girl who is driving in the back of her family's car, driving to a new home somewhere in suburban Japan. And on the way to their new home at the very beginning of the film, they get kind of sidetracked and get lost. Her parents turn into pigs, and the daughter, the child, has to save them by traveling to the spirit world ultimately and conversing with many fantastic characters in a magical bathhouse to convince the spirits that she's worthy of saving her parents. And that's ultimately the whole film. That's ultimately the whole film. Of course, how Miyazaki and the filmmakers and the animators fill in those details is, of course, what makes this film so special and so magical to so many people, yeah? Let's talk about the characters. Of course, the protagonist of this film is named Chihiro. Actually, she has two names. Her name is switched from Chihiro to Sen later on in the film, somewhere in the midway point. Why? Well, we'll discuss that a little bit, and what sort of effect and how should we interpret that change of name in the middle of the film. In any case, before we talk about all that, though, I do think that it's fascinating that, like many of Miyazaki's protagonists in many of his animated films, this protagonist is a young female girl, a child, ultimately. It looks like she's probably preteen even, right? And that is very interesting. Why is it that the filmmaker has chosen to make the protagonist of this film a young girl? It brings to mind other young girls in fantastic settings, right? I'm thinking of Dorothy from Wizard of Oz. Also, Alice from Alice in Wonderland comes to mind. Wendy from Peter Pan kind of comes to mind too. What is it about young female protagonists that makes some fantasy filmmakers and fantasy storytellers so intrigued and motivate them to create such a fantastic film? Well, let's talk about that. How certainly we could talk about feminist concerns here, right? What is the difference between a female and a male, right? And Miyazaki does borrow and buy into and sell us some of those traditional stereotypes. What's a young girl, a stereotypical young girl versus a stereotypical young boy, right? In this film, well, she's much more innocent. She's much more, in this film, she's much more, what would we say? She's much more innocent, certainly is the case. She's also much more just pure goodness, right? I know that I, having been a young boy, and still having some of those young boy tendencies, I remember being a young boy and how much trouble I got into as a young boy, and what a troublemaker I was. I might get into a little bit of trouble still today even. Whereas Miyazaki really goes with this trope that the young female protagonist is innocent, is filled with goodness and purity, and really doesn't have many of the character flaws that many of the other characters in the film have, including her own parents and some of the spirits even, right? But she does have one interesting flaw, right? And that is very clear cut right at the beginning of the film, such that she doesn't want change. She doesn't like that she has to move. She complains to her parents in the backseat of her car that she has to go to a new school and be in a new home. So she doesn't like that sort of change that's coming upon her. And Miyazaki, through the course of the film, this character arc is that she engages with this change. She confronts the changes. She confronts the challenges that are put in front of her throughout many steps of this film. And she overcomes all those challenges, thus becoming a more mature character, right? And a very ambitious and motivated character, rather than simply a character who sits in the backseat of the car whining. What else might be interesting about making the protagonist not merely a female, but a young female? A young female. Because we see very early in this film that she is positioned as contrary to her parents, who are mature, who are old. And thus, one thing that should come to our mind right away is the dynamic of generational conflict. She's younger and the parents are older. We'll see how that plays out as a theme throughout this film as well, right? Where we see this very young girl who's, as I expressed earlier, who is filled with innocence and filled with good old-fashioned morality, versus the parents, yes, who are mature, less naive, but also having all sorts of other character flaws that come along with maturity, namely greed, materialism, etc., right? Gluttony, especially. So we see this generational conflict, I believe, under my interpretation, that is being expressed in this film, and we'll try to figure out why Miyazaki does make a film with such generational conflict. Yeah? Of course, we see many other characters throughout this film as well. We see witches, magical witches. Again, reminds me of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, right? Where we have two witches who are sisters, but in antagonistic roles, sort of, or that are different from each other, at least. We see Chihiro's, or Sen's, we see her kind of companion also, or her supporting character, Haku, right? And Haku is a boy, of course, but he's also a water dragon, or a river dragon, yes? Because he is part of this spiritual world. How does that support play out throughout this film? I think it's very interesting, in fact, right? And we will see a lot of this other theme really manifest throughout, and that is the theme, well, he's a water dragon or a river dragon. What does that have to say about the spirits of nature and the spirits in the environment, right? And what is her relationship, Chihiro's, and not just Chihiro's, but humanity's relationship or connections with the environment, with nature, and all that stuff. So those are a lot of the issues that we'll talk about today when we take a little bit of a closer look at Spirited Away, right? Another famous character for which they make many toys and things like that and illustrations is the character of No Face, and how this character, who's silent and doesn't speak throughout this film and has a mask, that's the name No Face, how he manifests certain characteristics and thus reconciles by the end of the film with not just Chihiro, but the community at large as well. I think that's going to be a very interesting dynamic. Here's what's really interesting to me about all of these different characters that I've listed. Certainly, there are antagonists to Chihiro. Now, what does that mean? If Chihiro, or Sen, is the protagonist, what is the role of the antagonist? Well, to be against, and to push against, and to motivate and push the protagonist a bit further, right? So there are antagonists in this film who work against her or threaten her or push her a little bit out of her comfort zone, right? Like I said earlier, of course, by the end of the film, she grows and she becomes a more mature individual. However, just because they're antagonists does not make them villains. And that's going to be a very interesting way that Miyazaki makes this film and crafts this film. He does have different antagonists who work against the protagonist. However, they're never especially villainous, right? And that did catch me for a little bit of a loop by the time I finished the film, right? Because by the time we finished the film, I don't want to say that everybody lives happily ever after, but after you finish the film and reconsider everybody's relationship, there never really was a villainous or any really malintents with the protagonist. Nobody wanted to really kill her or squash her goals. Rather, everybody's got their own unique perspectives in this world. And everybody's got their own unique motivations and goals. And in recognizing that, Miyazaki has crafted an amazing film such that nobody's villainous. But if we could just step back for a second and recognize that everybody is an individual with their own goals, or an individual with their own place in society, and trying to put forward their own motivations, then that's really interesting because it illustrates that they are not villainous. They're not evil. There are no evil characters in this movie. Rather, there's just different people with different perspectives. And that's what I really find fascinating about this film. And by the way, so many of Miyazaki's films also, is that there isn't an especially terrible villain, but there are just different interests in mind. And that when we do watch this movie, I know when I first watched this movie, I'm watching it, and there are a couple of characters who seem particularly villainous on first glance. But as the story develops, you realize, oh, and perhaps, again, this is just my own preconceived notions of what an animated film should have, right? A hero, or in this case, a heroine, and overcoming some villain. And this movie doesn't have a heroine who overcomes some villain. Rather, she's just overcoming her own, let's say, insecurities or her own character flaws, and thus recognizing her own place in the greater society around her. Because after all, everybody's got character flaws. Both antagonists, protagonists, and everyone else besides. Supporting characters too have their own flaws. But that doesn't make them villainous or evil. And this film does a nice job, Miyazaki does a nice job of painting such depth in each of these supporting characters such that we recognize and we realize by the end, there's nobody who's especially evil. It's just that they've all got their own unique perspectives and their own unique goals. And as such, shouldn't we try to understand each person in our community, in our society, in the society of this film, with a little bit more tolerance, perhaps, with a little bit more understanding, with a little bit more patience. And of course, we have the heroine in this film, Chihiro and Sen, who does approach everybody with so much more patience and understanding and tolerance. This is especially painted out very nicely when the stink blob comes in from outside, comes into the bathhouse from outside, and everybody can see the stink blob coming a mile away. And there's warnings, and everybody's like, oh, here comes a real stinker. Get ready, get ready. And then, of course, when the stink blob even comes into the bathhouse, what happens? Everybody's, turned off. Everybody's very disgusted by this visiting character who just wants to be cleaned. And the only character who approaches this stink monster, this stink blob, with any sort of patience or understanding is, of course, Chihiro, or Sen, as she is called when she's a worker. And it's in this patience, it's in this understanding that she exhibits towards this character, where she could finally clean off the stink blob and let the true nature, the true essence of this character really flourish as a spirit just like every other. A spirit who flies away and becomes just as magnificent as every other character in the film. And it was only after Chihiro says, wait, let's listen to see what you want. And then she, unclogs some sort of plug or something that allows all of the filth to escape or to be cleaned off ultimately. And really we get to see the stink blob's true essence. And I think that's what Miyazaki might be suggesting in this film. Is let's look at people. Let's look at others. Especially others whom we're disgusted by, whom we're turned off by. And look at them with a bit more patience and try to understand where they're coming from. So that not only will that character flourish, but of course it illustrates to others that, wow, look at what Chihiro has done. Look at what Sen has done in this case. She's done something quite magnificent. And they all learned the lesson. Ah, look at her. And of course, this helps her grow. Because who wanted to clean the stink blob anyway? Nobody, but she steps up. She addresses the problem that's put in front of her with patience and understanding. And of course, everybody wins in the end. Again, no real villains. No real villains, because after all, I can understand being faced with a task that I really don't want to take on. I felt that way before. Does that make me villainous? Of course not. But it might do me a little bit better if I could learn the lesson that Sen is trying to impart to us, that Miyazaki really is trying to impart to us, which is approach this with a bit of patience. Approach these challenges with a bit of understanding. Approach others with a bit of tolerance. And just listen to what they might have to say. Because you might learn something and you might both flourish as a result. Now, how about we talk about the setting of the film? Now, the bulk of the film is in this magical bathhouse in the spirit world. But let's not jump the gun too much. Let's back up a little bit and talk about the very beginning of the film and, of course, the very ending of the film. What is the setting of this film? And as they drive up, as the film opens, we see the family of three, the small family of three, driving to their new home in Japan, presumably way out in the suburbs. So this is a film where we see suburban Japan, well, at least far away, because we never really visit the suburbs, but we also visit, right? Because as I said at the very beginning here, they took a wrong turn at a certain place. And what do they come upon? The setting at the beginning of the film is this abandoned amusement park. And now, of course, setting and history are going to go very hand in hand here. What does it mean that Miyazaki has put or set this film in an abandoned amusement park? What does it mean to be an abandoned amusement park? Well, amusement parks are typically places where people go to have wonderful joy, have fun. However, this amusement park has been abandoned. It's failed, economically speaking. Why is that interesting? Because in 2001, when this movie was released, Japan was, of course, in the midst of its lost decade. Its lost decade. That is, what is Miyazaki talking about in all of post-war Japan up until the 90s? Up until the 90s, Japan experienced an economic miracle where Japan became the second richest country in the world, right, after the United States. And then what happened? Well, the bubble burst. The economic bubble burst. And for a decade, well, here we are. Here I am talking about this film in the year 2020. It's actually, some people will say it's the lost 3 decades by now. That Japan has experienced this long period of economic stagnation. after this economic miracle, where it became the second richest country in the world. And by 2001, it was still the second richest country in the world in terms of GDP, of course. But that will be soon overtaken about a decade later by China. And now Japan is the third richest country in the world. But what is Miyazaki trying to say with that comment about, let's put this location in an abandoned amusement park? The economic bubble has burst. What else has burst? Well, all of this faith that we've had, that we Japanese have had in what we were doing, in this amazing building boom, building amusement parks. And now we've got a beautiful sign of the economic stagnation and this bubble bursting in this abandoned amusement park, which isn't the most uncommon thing in Japan anyways. So Miyazaki is, I think, commenting upon, look at what we've done through the setting. Look at what we've done. Look at what we missed out on. We were so greedy. I am going to explore some of these themes. I think this is one of the key themes of this film, greed. Of course, we see the parents at the beginning of the film. They become pigs. Well, if there ever was a symbol for greed, a pig. Why do they become pigs? Because they break in or come upon this amusement park and there's food waiting for them. And what do the parents do? They take the free food and they eat away and they gorge themselves on free food. Might Miyazaki be saying that's what Japan did during this economic bubble, during this economic boom? That Japanese society was stealing all this free food out of greed, out of gluttonness, out of gluttony, and saying, look at what we've done. Look at what Japanese society has done. We were so gluttonous and we've turned into pigs. And what happens when we do that? Well, of course, the economic bubble bursts. Now, we can get into details about exactly how this economic bubble burst, right? You should probably talk to an economist who can explain these things much clearer than I can. But a couple of key things to consider here with this Japanese economic bubble bursting. Number one is there's very similar to the 2008 economic crisis. Japan experienced something quite similar in the 90s, which is there was created a moral hazard such that banks and companies were becoming too big to fail. And banks that should have, or businesses that should have failed, weren't allowed to fail. And as such, you create a moral hazard such that you keep supporting, and society keeps supporting these institutions and these businesses that really should have failed. And of course, when you support people doing bad behavior, what happens? Well, they'll continue doing their bad behavior, of course. And that's what I mean by moral hazard. Another terrible feature of the bubble bursting or the bubble economy is rampant speculation. I think anybody who is into Bitcoin can consider what speculation means. That is, a lot of people think that something's going to be valuable, so they dive all in to something, right? Now, this is quite a different problem than moral hazard. But what ends up happening is when people look around and they say, oh my goodness, they all decide, collectively, society decides, oh my goodness, we all speculated that this would be very valuable, but turns out it wasn't. Turns out I don't really see much value in this. Then, of course, speculative bubbles burst as well. Another interesting part about all this that has really kept the stagnation going and kept it stagnant instead of growing, right, is what some economists have called a liquidity trap. And that is that the money, ultimately, liquid money, is just not as valued by people in society. And so much so that traditional monetary policies no longer work. What is a monetary policy that helps people spend money? right, is lowering interest rates. And so you lower interest rates, which means don't save your money, because if you save your money, we're lowering interest rates and you're not really going to be saving a lot of money. Your money will not grow interest in the bank. And therefore, you try to encourage people to spend money. However, what do people not do in a liquidity trap? They still don't spend the money. They're still not exchanging money. The money isn't circulating anymore. And if the interest rate drops to zero, then what is a central bank to do? Right? Well, this is where it gets really crazy, of course, in Japan, because they have done in history, dropped the interest rates to below zero, right? And yet still there's an odd phenomenon such that the Japanese populace is not spending money as it should, and the economy continues to stagnate. The other challenge of the bubble bursting in Japan is the baby boom, right? And there is this generational conflict. And of course, all over the world, in America, I think many people are anticipating a similar sort of bubble bursting, such that the elderly population who don't work are increasing. And of course, the younger generations are not having as many children. And thus there's this imbalance, a generational imbalance, such that it's becoming way more difficult, financially speaking, for the working youth of society to support all the elderly, non-working individuals in society. What do we do? Especially since Japan has one of the longest living rates in the world, one of the greatest longevity rates in the world, where people are the oldest in society, right? So all of these things, now I've of course oversimplified all of that economic bubble bursting, but all of those things have contributed and play a role in some degree, some more than others, in this great stagnation, or this lost decade, which has turned into a lost 20 years, which has turned into a lost 30 years now. Many people are speculating. So is Miyazaki, let's bring this back to Miyazaki's Spirited Away now. Is Miyazaki commenting upon this? I think so. And I think that it's especially prescient of him to make the protagonist a youthful character. A youthful character looking to her parents, and saying, no, parents, stop eating. At the very beginning of the film, stop eating. Stop being so greedy. Stop being so gluttonous. And it really is, isn't it, the older generation who have put us here by all the things that I talked about regarding the economic bubble bursting. In this film, of course, it's manifest mostly, or expressed mostly, in the character flaw of greed and consumerism and materialism and greed for money, greed for gold. But in so many of the other aspects that I've talked about regarding the economic bubble bursting, isn't it the youth who typically say, you old people, you old folks have done this to us. It's your fault I can't get a job. Wow, Miyazaki made this movie in the year 2001. Doesn't this argument sound especially prescient in the year 2020, in the United States at least? I think so. I've heard this all the time. What is the idea that some people suggest? Hey, boomer. And Miyazaki is foretelling that phenomenon, which is this generational conflict that's happening, saying those older people have ruined society. Now, we can expand beyond that aspect of the economic bubble bursting, and let's also talk about a key problem that Miyazaki loves discussing, a key theme that he explores in so many of his films, which is environmentalism. Environmentalism. And let's talk about the history around environmentalism. Well, environmentalism, of course, became very popular in the 70s or so, 1970s, and has become so much more popular even today. And I think the environmentalism that Miyazaki wants to express, the environmentalist values that he tries to express in this film, he wears quite on his sleeve, right? Very much on his sleeve. I already relayed the story about the stink blob that comes into the bathhouse and wants to be cleaned. And all that he needed was to be cleaned. He's a wonderful spirit of nature, except he's overly polluted. Terribly so. Terribly overly polluted. And what does he need to thrive, to flourish? He just needs to be cleaned. Just like so much in nature today needs to be cleaned. And isn't it interesting, I think, again, an amazing foreshadowing effect that Miyazaki presents, is that he calls the protagonist a young female character, a youthful female child. And isn't that fascinating? Because in the year 2020, we see children stepping up and saying, gosh darn it, you elderly and older generations, you've ruined the world for us. Please change our ways. We need to change. Why? Because the idea being, at least to some of these folks, is that the youth have energy. The youth have the motivation. The youth see the problems that the older generations have ignored. Why have they ignored them? Well, Miyazaki suggests because of greed, among other things, and consumerism, which are both features of the economic miracle, but more like an economic bubble that burst. And so with that, now we understand the setting quite a bit better, now that we understand this history. And we see how the characters, and why Miyazaki uses characters the way he does, so that he can express these themes in a much more creative manner, in a much more effective manner. Because aren't children, perhaps, not the mature adults, but the children who haven't been poisoned by a culture that teaches them to be consumerists, be materialists, to be greedy, aren't children the way of the future? And I think that might be a huge message that Miyazaki is trying to put forward with not just this film, but so many of his films, in fact. The other aspect of setting that Miyazaki places the narrative in throughout basically the far majority of this film is this magical bathhouse, right? Now, I think the bathhouse is very fascinating for several reasons. The first reason that I'll discuss is the fact that, of course, it's a bathhouse, a place for cleaning, right? Now, this ties very closely into this environmentalist thing. As I've already said, we have that big scene where Chihiro-sen cleans the big stink blob, and that really only makes sense within a bathhouse. The reason that the bathhouse fits so nicely with that is because it is her role as a human being. As a human being, her role is to clean the stink blob to its original beautiful glory so that it can flourish in nature again in its proper role, right? And of course, it's the human's job, in this case, Chihiro-sen, to clean this monster. The other aspect of this bathhouse, right, as a proper setting for this film, is the fact that when Chihiro approaches the proprietress, Yubaba, of the bathhouse, she says, you humans don't belong in here. It's for us spirits, we natural spirits. After all, you humans pollute everybody. You humans pollute who we are and what we are and exploit so much of what we're here to do. For that reason, this spiritual bathhouse is in place to clean and cleanse nature, right? And that is a very important aspect of this setting, why this magical bathhouse is in that place. Let's talk a little bit about the second key aspect that I see, that my interpretation is bringing to this bathhouse, and that is the fact that a bathhouse is a very Eastern phenomenon, right? And even east of Eastern Europe, right? So yeah, Eastern Europe and then continue east. People do participate in this bathhouse, and of course bathhouses where people bathe in public and bathe with others as a community, cleanliness as a communal activity, right, is a Japanese phenomenon. But more interestingly, it's not an American phenomenon and not a Western European phenomenon, right? Why is that so important? Well, for a couple of different reasons. It's very clear to me and to many viewers that Miyazaki is presenting this movie as a Japanese movie. It's a very Japanese-y movie. It smells Japanese. It looks Japanese. All the spirits are Japanese. The dragons are Japanese. The other animals are Japanese looking. Of course, the bathhouse has a very Japanese look to it. So the immediate question then is Miyazaki trying to posit this East-West dichotomy and say, look, this is East, this is West, and I'm setting this movie in an Eastern Japanese bathhouse, not an American bathhouse, which there are no American bathhouses, or if there are, they're, in certain ethnic enclaves, right? Again, is Miyazaki then asking us to put this East-West dichotomy on the plate? Now, of course, first instinct would be to say yes. However, I've already compared this movie, and many people have told me, right, in even private discussions, oh, clearly Spirited Away is a uniquely Japanese film, right? And that's quite odd to me. You heard me mention almost at the very early part of this discussion that I see connections right away with Alice in Wonderland and even Wizard of Oz, right? And when you look at Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland, you wonder if Miyazaki just repackaged those two stories, or an amalgam of those two stories, into this movie, right? After all, what's even fascinating to talk about the connection is the very ending of the movie, where the protagonist isn't sure if she dreamed the whole thing or not. She goes, wait, was that a dream? Well, that's exactly what happens at the end of Alice in Wonderland. That's exactly what happens at the end of Wizard of Oz to Dorothy. It would be quite odd to suggest that Miyazaki is putting forward this East-West dichotomy as being opposed to each other. That's quite fascinating, since Miyazaki is working in a medium which was ultimately developed in the West. Number one, cinema, the moving image, but number two, also animation, which blew up as a result of the American filmmaker Walt Disney. And I don't think that Miyazaki is so narrow-minded or narrow-focused in goal to say East versus West, especially in the fact that many of the films he's adapted, many of his own films, have been adaptations of Western films and set in very Western locales, very Western settings. So, yeah, that idea for me just doesn't hold very much water, right? Well, then why would he want to make a film that is so Japanese? Well, some people might say, well, since he's made so many Western-influenced films in Western settings and based on Western adaptations, right? Here's why he made Spirited Away, because he wanted finally to make a Japanese film. Maybe. Or maybe he recognized his global appeal. Miyazaki did. Miyazaki recognizes his global appeal and said, you know what people really love? Good old-fashioned Japanese-y stuff. And I'm going to give the public the Japanese sort of veneer on top of a very global message. Very global message, which is environmentalism, character growth, and peace and understanding and patience. But just put a nice Japanese veneer on top so that it can be more palatable, especially in the early part of the 21st century. More palatable to a global public, when Japan was the epitome of cool. As a matter of fact, that's another aspect that this plays into, right? The whole Japanese government was trying to spread Japanese culture in this sort of soft power sort of way, to say, look, all over the world, people love Japan. People love Japanese animated films, Japanese animated products, Japanese illustration, Japanese characters. Look how cool Japan is. So even though there's this odd economic decline for Japan after decades of economic miracle. Well, perhaps we could counter that with spreading cool Japan. Yeah, and Miyazaki's film plays into that very nicely, doesn't it? That Miyazaki being the coolest of Japanese animated filmmakers, making a Japanese film. And there is, of course, like I said earlier, this film won the American Academy Award for Best Animated Film. It took over this Western institution, a Japanese film. A Japanese film. After, of course, many other, and since Disney basically owns the Oscar for Best Animated Film. Most of those films either by Disney or there's a few in there by DreamWorks too. But by far Disney, American films. But here's this gem of a film. Japanese film, cool Japanese film that does win the Academy Award. And isn't this part of the greater global spread, right, of not just Japan, not just manga or Japanese comics, not just Japanese animated products, but yeah, so much of cool Japan in general. Now we could talk about the pros and cons of this thing a little bit more. That might be a nice discussion for another time. But I think that it is a little bit narrow focused to suppose that Miyazaki is going east versus west, when from the beginning it's so clear that Miyazaki is a 21st century filmmaker in an international 21st century world. And he takes advantage of that. He takes advantage of that and understands certain features that do make for a pretty good film product. And we might say that that Japanese setting, the Japanese-ness of Spirited Away, I don't want to be so cynical and say it's contrived. But I do want to back off a little bit and say, wait a second, don't we understand the context a little bit better? Let's try to understand the context a little bit better about where this Japanese-ness is and how this Japanese-ness is being presented, right? And I think that's all very important, especially in a globalized film market. Now, I've already talked about many of the things that Miyazaki examines and presents in this film. I've talked about the consumerism of the older generation. I've talked about, of course, that generational conflict that occurs between the youth and the parents. I've talked about the environmentalism. But one thing that's quite fascinating in this film that we might want to talk about is identity. Identity. This is most explicitly drawn out by the fact that Chihiro, when she becomes a worker in the bathhouse and signs the contract, Yubaba takes away her name and gives her another name, Sen. She is now a worker. Her identity has changed upon signing the contract. What might that be about? How might we interpret that phenomenon in this film? Well, one interpretation of that might be the fact that aren't we all changed quite a bit once we become laborers or once we become part of this capitalist system where you're a cog in this society? And isn't that what happens to Sen in this portion of the film? She's a cog, she's a worker in the bathhouse. And her goal in the bathhouse is to, follow rules. And even, her name is erased. Her name is erased, and look at how she lives. At a point, she's sleeping in a communal sleep area where she's just one of many workers. Now, doesn't that kind of fit in very nicely? What the ideas, the notions that I'm selling right here, doesn't that fit in nicely with this consumerist, materialist, greed-based aspect that I put forward earlier upon viewing this film? Such that Miyazaki is speaking a bit against this same overly capitalistic, overly market-based system. So much so that doesn't the market system change us fundamentally. Our name changes. We lose our name. We lose who we are. And by the way, she loses her clothes too. Her clothing changes upon signing this contract. And might Miyazaki be saying something about that phenomenon in real life? Well, I remember my first job. Oh, yeah, at my first job, I did have to change my clothes. I did have to change my clothes. I did have to, change my behavior, change the way I was. Right? Don't we change fundamentally once we enter into this market-based system? And Miyazaki, I feel like, is trying to push against that idea, and say something like, wait, maybe we shouldn't change fundamentally. Maybe we should try to be a little bit more like Sen and retain some of our goodness, some of our essential goodness that all youth has. After all, look at Sen. Instead of being completely ingrained in the system, once No Face comes in, No Face throws money everywhere. Says, oh, I want everything that's here. Here's all kinds of gold for everybody. And everybody in the whole bathhouse goes after No Face's money, except Sen. She retains a bit of that goodness. She retains a bit of her goodness and says, no, that's okay. I don't need any money. And then, of course, No Face, as he's spreading money everywhere, becomes what? A monster, right? And starts even eating people. So greedy that he's eating people. And Sen says, I don't want any of your food. That's fine. I don't need any of your gold. That's fine. And her patience with No Face again. Of course, it first manifests itself with this big stink blob, but then manifests much later a second cycling of this thing where she's patient with No Face. No Face follows her out to the train. She says, oh, do you want on the train too? Yeah, come on, let's go. And of course, No Face finds peace at the end of the movie. Not as a money-spending monster that eats people, but he finds a place in society through Sen's patience, understanding, tolerance, and help. And might Miyazaki be trying to put forward that sort of goal for our role in society? Don't lose yourself with your job. Stay that good person that is inside of you. As opposed to so many of the other characters, even the spirits are corrupted by greed. Even if the darkest spirits, or even if the most natural spirits and most wonderful spirits in nature can be corrupted by greed. Well, of course, we can be corrupted by greed too, and we should check that motivation towards corruption. Check it and ask, how can I be more understanding, more patient, more like Sen? And of course, what happens in the film, as Sen is more helpful, she remembers her old name because she never really gave up her identity. It was always there. It was always there, despite the fact that others tried to strip away her name, her clothes. Essentially, we are good inside. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of my discussion when I suggested that the characters in this movie, there are no bad characters in this movie. Everybody's just got their perspective. We just have to understand them. And I'm wondering if that's really the motivation that Miyazaki is trying to push forward here. Be patient. Understand that we're all in this crazy game. We're all working together in this crazy world, this crazy bathhouse, in the case of Spirited Away. And we're all trying to move forward. Let's not eat each other. Let's try to understand each other, including each other as individuals, including each other as environment and person, including each other as individual versus, or individual coupled with community. And it seems like this is a key appeal of Miyazaki's films, is this essential goodness that he recognizes in everybody, in humanity. And he's not so cynical as to forget of that essential goodness. And he wants to remind us of that. Now, of course, I haven't talked much about the nature of the animation in this movie, but many people are attracted to the beauty of the animation, without question. But I think even the most beautiful animation wouldn't be popular without the most beautiful of message, which is, let's try to be patient and understanding of each other around us and the world around us. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.